Is Windows 11 better for gaming, or should you downgrade back to Windows 10? That is a question I get asked a lot, and it's been something I've been wondering for quite a while. And, I've been putting off this testing for far too long. You know how things are, life gets in the way. But I finally found out the results for myself. And my take on this is pretty unique because I won't be comparing stock Windows 11 versus stock Windows 10. So I'm not talking about retail Windows 11 Pro versus retail Windows 10 Pro. But what I'm going to be doing is comparing Windows 11 IoT Enterprise LTSC versus Windows 10 IoT Enterprise LTSC. I'm just going to call them Windows 10 IoT because that's just a shorter way of saying it. It's a mouthful, but just bear with me on that one. I'll explain why, and I'll be discussing all of that with the benchmarks in this video. So let's get into it. Hey, what is going on, guys? Danny here. Welcome back to the channel, and I hope you're all doing well. So today we're going to be taking a look at a wide variety of benchmarks comparing Windows 10's gaming performance against Windows 11. And I've been meaning to test this for quite some time now. It was just a matter of finding the time, and things lately in the hardware scene have been kind of dead, so there's been a lack of motivation there, if I'm to be honest. But hey, I've been getting a number of requests from, viewers of the channel, and I thought this would be a pretty good follow-up to one of my previous content pieces that I did where I discussed and showed people how you could install a very clean, lean copy of Windows 10 onto their machines, which was Windows 10 IoT Enterprise LTSC. One of the reasons why this topic of comparing different versions of Windows and their gaming performance comes up is because people have lately just gotten sick and tired of Windows 11, thanks to all the bloat, the telemetry, the ads that Microsoft shoves in your faces, the unwanted apps, the AI crap, where instead of actually making the experience, feel productive and user-friendly, it feels like the trend is in the opposite direction. And so, a lot of people, when discussing online, would talk about either switching back to Linux or going back to Windows 10. Now, I've talked about these subtopics in more detail in my previous video, so I'll have links to those in the description or the cards wherever you want to click it, but feel free to check them out. But the way I've approached this comparison is that instead of benchmarking a retail copy of Windows 11 Pro versus Windows 10, the previous version of retail that was out, like you might have seen from other tech tubers, I'll actually be comparing Windows 10 IoT Enterprise versus Windows 10 IoT Enterprise. For the past year, and I've always been recommending people go this route instead of your typical Windows retail copy. Even if your machine already came with, stock Windows 11, I honestly recommend nuking that install and just going this route. It's so much cleaner out of the box, and with a custom auto unattend script, things can become even better, leaner, and cleaner, and just makes the system feel that much more responsive, and there is actually an impact on your RAM usage and overall resource management. And, this applies to both Windows 10 and 11. I'm not saying that, you should just do Windows 11 IoT. If you prefer a more legacy operating system like Windows 10 for the cleanest route, I recommend that as well. In fact, that is what my last video was fully based on. And Windows 11 IoT is still totally viable. I actually use it on my MSI Claw, and it feels just as lightweight as Windows 10 IoT. But the real question is, which one is ultimately better for gaming performance? So to test this, I benchmarked 20 games, and I tested at 1080p low settings because the goal here isn't to see which version of Windows gives you the prettiest experience, it's to reveal whether the operating system is affecting performance. When you benchmark in a GPU-bound scenario like 4K with epic or ultra settings, the graphics card becomes the primary bottleneck, which can hide or compress any differences between the two operating systems. By testing in a more CPU-bound environment, it becomes easier to expose differences when it comes to scheduling, overhead, frame times, and general system behavior. In other words, if there is a performance gap between Windows 10 IoT LTSC and Windows 11 IoT LTSC, this is the kind of setup that you're most likely going to see it in. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll always see the exact same gap at higher resolutions like 1440p or 4K because, once the GPU becomes the bottleneck, OS differences usually matter way less. But if you want to evaluate operating system itself, then testing in a CPU-limited scenario is the better way to go about it and to isolate them. As for the hardware, we're testing on my test bench, which has a Ryzen 7 9800X3D, which I've overclocked using PBO and Curve Optimizer. For the RAM, we've got 32GB of DDR5 running at 6200 megatransfers, CL28 with tuned timings. The motherboard is an MSI X870 Tomahawk. The graphics card is an RTX 4090, which runs at 3000 MHz and has a plus 1500 offset on the memory. And for storage, we're using a Corsair 4TB MP600 LPX Pro Gen 4 drive. For full system specs, check the video description below, or I guess just pause the video. So with all of that out of the way, let's jump into our first benchmark, which is Battlefield 6. And right off the bat, we see some interesting results here. We can see that with Windows 11 IoT, it's actually faster overall than Windows 10 IoT. It's not a huge difference, and both are still very smooth. Windows 11 IoT is only faster on average by 4%, whereas for the lows, we're looking at 1 to 2% margins. The next game we have is Arc Raiders, and we see that with Windows 11 IoT, it comes out on top here, but unlike Battlefield 6, we're looking at some pretty big margins. 13% for the average FPS, 22% on the 1% lows, and 7% on the 0.1% lows. And I went back and double checked all settings. I wasn't using any special config files either. I did notice initially with Windows 10, HAGS was actually disabled by default, and I made sure to enable it for all of my testing as it comes enabled on Windows 11, but that didn't make a difference. Arc Raiders just seems to run better on Windows overall, and TechSpot actually found similar results when they were testing Windows 11 Pro versus Windows 10 Pro, though their margins were smaller since they benchmarked using Epic settings, so more GPU-bound results. So yeah, if you guys play Arc Raiders and you play it avidly and you want max FPS, then you're going to want Windows 11. The next game we have is Black Ops 6, and just like the other shooters, we see Windows 11 come out on top, though like Battlefield 6, the margins were relatively minimal, 6% on the average FPS, 5% on the 1% lows. Moving on, and we have Marvel Rivals. Between the two operating systems, performance remains relatively close with a slight edge to Windows 11 for the average and 0.1% lows, but slightly better 1% lows on Windows 10 IoT. Up next, we have Monster Hunter Wilds, which is a primarily GPU-bound game as evident by the results seen here. But we do see that on Windows 10 IoT, the 0.1% lows are better by around 6%. Final Fantasy Dawntrail shows us results that you can expect from an MMO type of title. With our figures seen here, nothing major to point out. Windows 11 does come out on top, but it's a slight victory over Windows 10 when looking at the three measured stats. The next game we have is The Outer Worlds 2, and there's really not much to say here. Performance between both operating systems is virtually identical. In Dying Light the Beast, we see a similar story play out. The lows between both of the configurations are about the same, with a 4% advantage in the average FPS for the Windows 11 IoT install. In Where Winds Meet, we see a solid victory for Windows 10 IoT, a 3% advantage for the average FPS for Windows 10, which isn't anything major, but then we see it's 7% faster in the 1% lows and 14% faster in the 0.1% lows. So clearly, frame time stability seems to be working better on the older operating system. With that said, the experience on Windows 11 would be just fine as well. Moving on, and we have Oblivion Remastered. Here things take a bit of a mixed turn. Windows 11 IoT comes out ahead in the average FPS by about 6% and holds a 7% lead in the 1% lows. So overall, it does look like a faster operating system here. But interestingly enough, Windows 10 IoT actually posted better 0.1% lows by a pretty noticeable margin. So while Windows 11 looks stronger overall, Windows 10 did have slightly better worst case frame time behavior in this one. Next up is Spider-Man 2, and there's really not much to talk about here because of the FPS cap. The results are basically identical. Average FPS is exactly the same, 1% lows are exactly the same, and Windows 10 has a tiny edge in the 0.1% lows. So for this game, whichever OS you're on, it clearly does not matter. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the more surprising, eye-opening results because here Windows 10 IoT actually comes out with a very convincing win. We're looking at about a 13% lead in average FPS, roughly 10% better 1% lows, and around 9% better 0.1% lows as well. That isn't a margin of error territory, this is a real difference, and for whatever reason, Cyberpunk just seems to heavily favor Windows 10 in this comparison. So if this was one of your main games, that's definitely a point in favor of Windows 10 IoT. Moving on, and we have Baldurs Gate 3, and we swing back in favor of Windows 11 IoT. The average FPS lead is only around 3%, so not a huge difference, but the lows are a bit more meaningful, with Windows 11 being roughly 10% faster in the 1% lows and about 7% faster in the 0.1% lows. So in this game, Windows 11 does appear to deliver smoother overall experience. With Expedition 33, the results tighten up once again. Windows 11 IoT is only ahead by 1% in the average FPS, while Windows 10 IoT has a tiny edge in the 1% lows and a somewhat better result in the 0.1% lows. But overall, this is still one of those games where performance is close enough that I wouldn't spend too much time reading into it. Next, we have Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and once again, the results are fairly mixed. Windows 10 IoT is slightly faster in the average FPS and 1% lows, but the margins are tiny, only 1 to 2%. Interestingly though, Windows 11 IoT comes out well ahead in the 0.1% lows, so while average performance is basically a wash, the worst dips were actually handled better on Windows 11. Moving on to Lies of P, and we see another case where the difference really just isn't that meaningful overall. Windows 10 IoT is a hair faster in the average FPS and 1% lows, while Windows 11 IoT claws back a small lead in the 0.1% lows. At the end of the day, both operating systems perform extremely well here, and there's no meaningful winner. Now, Stalker 2 is a really interesting one because while the average FPS between both of the operating systems is basically identical, the low FPS numbers are not. Windows 11 IoT absolutely crushes Windows 10 IoT here for some reason. In the lows, we're looking at about a 27% advantage for the 1% lows and a roughly 26% lead in the 0.1% lows. So even though the average frame rate might suggest both operating systems are the same, the actual gameplay smoothness looks substantially better and feels better on Windows 11 in this title. This is exactly why I'm always urging you guys to look beyond average FPS. For The Last of Us Part 2, there is once again very little separation between the two. Windows 10 IoT is ahead by 1% in the average FPS and a few percent in the 1% lows, while the 0.1% lows are identical. So this is another game where I'd basically call it a tie. Up next is Space Marine 2, and just like the previous result, the differences are very minor. Windows 10 has a slight edge across the board, but we're talking about margins that are so small, they're really not worth overanalyzing. You won't notice it. In practice, both operating systems are performing about the same here. And lastly, we have Hogwarts Legacy, where Windows 10 IoT does take a small lead in average FPS, coming in about 3% faster, while the lows are effectively the same between both of the operating systems. So again, yes, Windows 10 technically wins on this one, but not enough that I'd call it a major difference. So when we zoom out and take a look at our 20 game average, we can see that overall performance difference between Windows 10 IoT and Windows 11 IoT is very similar, basically within margin of error with a slight edge going towards Windows 11. Now obviously this chart does oversimplify things, and that's why we went through the various games one by one to point out specifically where each of the OSs thrive. And what I noticed was that when it comes to multiplayer games, this is where performance was better on Windows 11, especially a game like Ark Raiders. But when it came to single-player games, both operating systems were either neck and neck, or would alternate on which one was faster or which one would provide more smoother frame times. Overall, guys, I think, whether you choose to go the more legacy route and stick with Windows 10, or you want to stay on the latest version of Windows 11, both operating systems will offer you a great performance, gaming performance experience either way you look at it. There is no major winner over here, and I think that is certainly a good thing. The key here is to ensure that you are obtaining a copy of Windows 11 IoT or Windows 10 IoT for a very lean and clean experience. And if you want to take things further, like I said, you can use a custom auto unattend script like I showed in my last video. So really the takeaway here is pretty straightforward. If you're already on Windows 10 IoT and everything is working well, I don't think these results are in any way strong enough to justify rushing out or changing your install of the operating system unless there is a specific game you're playing 24/7 and it, works better on that one operating system. But, if you're setting up a fresh system today, especially if you are into those multiplayer games, then Windows 11 IoT is probably going to make more sense for you overall. It's still very clean, has all the extra little bit of perks for newer apps. Things like the Xbox full screen experience work on it. And of course, there is also the long-term angle to consider. And because even though gaming performance might be about the same today, Windows 11 clearly is going to be the platform that Microsoft is going to keep pushing for the future. And not just Microsoft, but other developers will also continue writing drivers for Windows 11, whereas I've already seen a lot of developers and manufacturers put Windows 10 in sort of a legacy mode, so they're not releasing drivers as often, or they've completely stopped writing drivers for it. So, when it comes to compatibility and long-term support, if that is a major concern, then yeah, going with Windows 11 is probably going to be better for you. But, that's going to be wrapping it up for this one. I hope you guys all enjoyed this one and learned something from it. We'll touch base in the next video. Take care.
If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.